Hello and welcome to Railroad Quarterly, my brand new train news series that replaced This Month on the Railroad a few months ago. Today we'll be covering all major North American train headlines that took place between September and December. And yes, before you say it, I'm aware that technically I'm off by a month for this to be considered a quarter 4 recap, but that's just the way it worked out, and I had to make room for this year on the railroad at the end of the month anyways. So without further ado, this is Railroad Quarterly. Starting all the way back in September, on the 4th, the Mexican government inaugurated the opening of one of the weirdest rail lines in North American history. After being forcefully taken over by Mexican armed forces in May, and later purchased by the Mexican government, a former Ferromex rail line between Coatzacoalcos and Salina Cruz was opened for federally funded freight service. This new line, known as the Ferrocarril de Istmo de Tehuantepec, or FIT for short, connects the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, acting as a rail-based canal through Mexico. This line, operated by the Mexican Navy, not only carries freight, but is being prepared for future passenger service between Medias Aguas and Salina Cruz, using a wide array of equipment. A small fleet of ex-Union Pacific SD-70s will power freight trains, while an imported British HST will be used for passenger trains. The difference between the size of this compact British train set and the SD-70Ms is honestly comical, and the fact that this even exists is both fascinating and a little bit concerning. 6 days later, up north in California, Bay Area Rapid Transit, otherwise known as BART, retired its A and B series railcars after more than 50 years of service. On the 15th, Canadian National released an AC44 CM numbered 3309 with historic Wafer logos. This unique AC44 later made its debut on the CN executive train. On the same day, the Reading and Northern released a 40th anniversary heritage unit, bringing back an obscure paint scheme used by the Blue Mountain in Reading, one of the Reading and Northern's predecessors. A week later, after years of planning, construction, and testing, privately funded intercity rail operator Brightline opened its Orlando extension, making for one of the most anticipated stories of the year. Operating trains every 2 hours out of Orlando, Brightline trains hit speeds as high as 125 miles per hour on a brand new dedicated line between Orlando International Airport and Cocoa, Florida. South of Cocoa, trains go 90 miles per hour on upgraded Florida East Coast tracks, allowing trains to traverse the 235 miles between Orlando and Miami in just about 3.5 hours. 4 days later, on the 26th, the Connecticut Department of Transportation ordered 6 dual-mode Siemens SC42 DM locomotives for use on the Metro North New Haven line, similar to how the state currently owns a small fleet of 4 P32s. These 6 locomotives will most likely be seen system-wide, but will operate most on rush-hour New Haven line trains using push-pull equipment. These 6 engines are expected to be delivered in 2027. The next day, more than 3 years after acquiring Bombardier Transportation, French manufacturer Alstom rebranded the Bombardier MultiLevel series to the Alstom Adessia Max in order to match new single-level Adessia cars being built for CT Rail. Though they've been in production since the early 2000s, these new cars will get a refresh with the MultiLevel 3 series, or Adessia Max EMU, which NJ Transit is expected to receive soon. On the 30th, Norfolk Southern received 2 unique AC44 C6Ms rebuilt for maintenance of way services. In addition to an interesting boxy cab design and cowl with car bodies, these engines debut a new NS Engineering Department paint scheme. Additionally, on the 30th, NJ Transit celebrated its 40th anniversary running a special excursion train. Into October, on the 3rd, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority held a public survey to decide the final paint scheme for the new Type 10 Green Line cars. These new renderings wildly differed from the original renderings, with relatively bland-looking trains and uninspired paint schemes. Personally, I was a fan of Option 2, but after 10 days, Option 3 proved to be the popular choice. On the 7th, NJ Transit released a GP40 and an Erie Heritage paint scheme. On the 11th, Siemens Mobility released the first Amtrak Airo car in part of a multi-billion-dollar order. Painted in a sharp Phase 7 paint scheme, this new passenger car will greatly modernize Amtrak's fleet with dual-mode push-pull trains. While this particular car doesn't have an interior yet, it's the first step in an order for more than 500 rail cars to be delivered starting in 2026. The next day, the California Department of Transportation finalized its $80 billion order for Stadler Flirt hydrogen fuel cell trains. Beginning in 2027, 4 trains will be delivered for the Altamont Corridor Express Merced to Sacramento line, and the state will have the option to order as many as 25 additional trains. On the 16th, Penn State became the first college to own its own train, taking delivery to a freshly repainted ST-60i. Since being delivered to the Altoona Railroaders Museum in October, rail transportation engineering students at the university's Altoona campus have used this locomotive for hands-on demonstrations in class. The next day, Chicago's Metra received funding for up to 16 battery-electric multiple-unit trains after scrapping their plans to convert 40-year-old F40 diesels to battery power. A manufacturer for these trains will be chosen soon. On the 22nd, CPKC released its third hydrogen fuel cell locomotive, this one being rebuilt from an AC44. In addition to its new cowl-width body, this is the first CP hydrogen locomotive to feature the CPKC logo, and technically the first locomotive across all of CPKC to wear the new logo. Additionally, in late November, CPKC ordered even more hydrogen fuel cells, hinting at more locomotives to come. On the 27th, Amtrak's first HHP-8 cab car conversion was spotted in Philadelphia. Reclassified as an HHP-C, this locomotive shell, renumbered 9750, will soon be used to replace 55-year-old Metroliner cab cars. It was spotted testing under the cover of night just a few days later. On the 31st, Ontario Northland held a poll to decide the paint scheme for future Northlander train sets built by Siemens Mobility. Of the two paint schemes teased, one looks like a knockoff NS paint scheme, while the other one looks like it's made to induce headaches. Speaking of locomotives that induce headaches, on the same day, Wabtec unveiled its first production FLXDrive battery locomotive for export to Australia. Though it's technically not American news, this locomotive was built right here in Erie, Pennsylvania, and will also most likely look identical to American variants set to debut in the near future. Therefore, it finds its way into this video. Finally, on to November. On the 6th, President Biden announced a $16.4 billion funding package for Amtrak to bankroll 25 infrastructure projects across the Northeast. Included are the B&P Tunnel replacement, the Pelham Bay Bridge replacement, and the Penn Station Access project. All very exciting stuff. The next day, Metro North released its third 40th anniversary unit, featuring a wrap commemorating the New York Central. Though I'm more of a Pennsy guy myself, I must say this is one good-looking engine. Across the Hudson, on the 17th, NJ Transit released yet another special locomotive, this time celebrating the 100th anniversary of Atlas, a model train company. This is among the most unique ad wraps I've ever seen on a locomotive, and to be honest, I have no idea what commuter is seeing an Atlas ad on an NJ Transit train and then buying some model trains. Regardless, it's a decent looking engine, and it's definitely cool that Atlas is releasing an identical model in N and HO scales. On the same day, Brightline West, a high-speed rail project set to connect Los Angeles and Las Vegas, made a big step towards being built. After a lengthy review process, the Surface Transportation Board approved the construction of this 180-mile-per-hour high-speed rail line between Las Vegas and Rancho Cucamonga, California. Now, Brightline is effectively ready to begin construction, so long as it receives a federal grant from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. 3 days later, the Mexican government issued a decree that private freight railroads such as Ferromex and CPKC must either begin to operate passenger services or allow the government to operate them on their lines, all with priority over freight trains. If these railroads don't come up with proposals for these services by January 15, 2024, the Mexican Navy and/or Army will begin to operate these passenger trains over these lines similarly to how they did the aforementioned FIT line. This basically just sounds like Mexico trying to create something like Amtrak, albeit in a much more entertaining way. On the 23rd, Florida East Coast's new paint scheme was spotted. Recently, the railroad's parent company, Grupo Mexico, decided to standardize paint schemes across its railroads, redesigning Ferromex's corporate look in 2022. Now, Florida East Coast locomotives will wear a similar scheme with a blue color palette rather than the red one. While it's a decent paint scheme overall, I don't think it looks as good as the older red paint scheme. On November 27th, CSX released its first heritage unit since August. This locomotive, number 1871, celebrates the Atlantic coastline, and interestingly enough, it does away with the fade between the cab and long hood. Personally, I'm glad they stopped doing the fade, but once again, it would be nice if the entire locomotive was painted in ACL colors. Either way, it's cool to see CSX's heritage program progress further. Finally, the next day, another CSX heritage unit was released, but this time it wasn't official. A few months ago, most likely in protest of the unpainted cabs on CSX's heritage units, someone vandalized a GP40 with a spot-on chassis paint scheme on the nose. After making quite the splash in the railfan community, it seems like they decided to do it again, repainting the nose of CSX GP40 number 6394 into a spot-on RF&P paint scheme. Once again, though this is technically vandalism, I think it looks amazing, and whoever did it even took the time to mask off placards and moving parts on the nose. And there you go. These are all the major North American railroading headlines from September to December. Though there were the expected big stories from Amtrak and Brightline, there were a few oddballs in there, such as what's going on in Mexico and the Atlas locomotive. Definitely an interesting quarter on the railroad. Now, it's December, and 2023 is coming to an end. Luckily, this month is a big one for the channel, with weekly uploads until the beginning of 2024, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.